Hello and welcome everyone to the seminar Cognitive Mapping, Althusser, Sellars and Giannotti with instructor JP Caron. I'll be reading the brief description of the seminar and then we pass the floor to JP. So let's start. And in Grundrisse, Marx comments on his methods of the critique of political economy. The population is an abstraction if I leave out, for example, the classes of which it is composed. These classes, in turn, are an empty phrase if I'm not familiar with the elements on which they rest, for example, wage labor, capital, etc. Culminating in the seminal formula, the concrete is concrete because it is the concentration of many determinations, hence, unity of the diverse. According to Althusser, fashioning concepts that are adequate to their objects is the domain of proper science, which is understood as the business of theoretical practice, amounting to 1. The elaboration of the set of generalities, 2. Through the mobilization of the resources of generalities, and 3. Out of the previously accepted set of ideological generalities. The processual character of the constitution of Althusserian science is similar to how Wilfrid Sellars engages with the development of science, while the successive images of man in the world as are constituted out or of our linguistic resources. In this seminar, we will compare the two pictures of science as proposed by Althusser and Sellars, with an eye on the problem of grasping the whole, which is the subject of Marx's introductory quote. In this sense, both Althusser and Sellars are seen engaged in the problem that Frederick Jameson famously called cognitive mapping. However, if the Jamesonian cognitive mapping, in the case of science, consists of the relationship of the subject of knowledge to the whole of which it is a part, in the Althusserian picture of ideology, it involves the imaginary relationship of individuals to their condition of existence. This double dependency puts pressure on how subjects are determined by language, not only as means of description, but also as normatively laden medium capable of constituting agents as such. However, in this process, language competes with capital in its constraint of subjectivity. Between norms and causes, we shall find a way out of the conundrum created by the ramification of these paths. Finally, we shall revisit the framework offered by Brazilian philosopher José Arthur Giannotti in his historical debate with Althusser concerning operational schemes and the constitution of abstract diagrams of action by capital. Giannotti is an especially interesting example, for he engages with the Althusserian school early on in 1977 with the Contra Althusser, offering a very robust account of the real abstraction in his 80 labors and reflection, finally becoming a Wittgensteinian scholar by 1995 presentation of the world. While some commenters of find Giannotti changes from Marx to Wittgenstein as a sign of capitulation, for us, it might offer an interesting path for relating the critique and description of the capital and the critique and description of language, as they have been presented in the program of so-called post-Sellarsian Marxism. Here, the wager is that this mediation will furnish us with a more full understanding of how social synthesis operates in the multi-layered complexity. J.P. Caron, or Structure, is a philosopher and musician based in Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, Brazil. He's a lecturer at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro and an instructor of the New Center of Research and Practice. As a musician, he released many albums, several through his own label, Seminal Records, and he's currently writing two books. One on the relationship between language, rule-following, forms of life, and value for in contemporary capitalism. One on the ontology of indeterminacy in experimental music from an internationalist point of view. JP, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gabriel. Yeah, I've it just dawned on me that the kind of the abstract is so detailed that kind of is making my perhaps this first presentation kind of idle. But anyway, we'll just flesh out what is in there, because basically first presentation, like the first sessions usually for me are like the kind of assembly of a certain problem space. So we'll put some flash into that, but at the same time not fully, because it's just like to motivate the kinds of contradictions and problems that we'll be dealing throughout the seminar. So I'll start sharing and kind of presenting what's my blueprint for this seminar. Okay. Um, okay. Are you seeing this? Let me see this. Change this. Where is
Yes, yes.
presentation? Okay. So yeah, I have it's color coded. Like there's like red and blue and green, because I mean there's kind of a different set of problem spaces: the Althusserian, the blue, the red, the Sellars, and the blue, and the Giannotti and the green. So throughout you'll see like a little bit some nods into these different spaces, so to speak, that relate to the central issue of cognitive mapping. That is the object of this seminar. Okay. So, well, yeah, it changed. Originally, the first version of this idea came from this presentation I gave at the Marxism and the Pittsburgh School Conference in last June in London. This was the plan of the presentation by then. Like I was like going to introduce the manifest and scientific image according to Sellars. These are actually, by the way, this is also online already. Like all the videos of that conference are online in the New Center's YouTube page. So you can check that out for a kind of a blueprint of what we're going to do. Of course, this will be much more developed, because we have like 4 sessions for that, for 2 hour and a half sessions for that, instead like of 40 minutes, of a 40 minutes talk. So by then the idea was to introduce the manifest and scientific image, then the concept of cognitive mapping, and the problem of cognitive mapping being tethered to ideology in the Althusserian sense, according to Jameson. Then the concept of theoretical practice in Althusser, and the problem of the real object in opposition to the object of knowledge. I know that it's a lot, but every single one of these terms will be understood throughout the seminar. And in the end, I was just offering like a problem, a way out of the problem of ideology in terms of patterns and world pictures with the Sallarsian kind of framework. And well, it does, and in the end, there's like a kind of a political kind of consequence to that, with a session on the materiality of ideology and cognitive mapping. Um, this was supposed, of course, like to kind of bridge the gap between like Marxism and the Pittsburgh School. This was like the the uh, um, uh, the proposal of that conference, and the proposal of, I mean, much of what I've been doing with value form, with Marxism lately. Like there have been like a different kind of a different set of also seminars for the New Center. Maybe the most important one was the real abstraction, the myths of given seminar. You can go back and revisit that, which are like a more like programmatic kind of set of issues. Here we are like dealing with a kind of a subset of those issues in this seminar. Okay, so just to introduce, like, why is it that this is important or interesting? Why is it that we are bridging like Althusser and Sellars and bringing in Giannotti? Giannotti, of course, wasn't in this presentation. Giannotti is specific to this seminar, but it's a very, very important author for me particularly. Okay, so, and how is it that the seminar relates to this program of that presentation? Let me tidy things up here a little bit. Yeah, like this. So yeah, this is in front to put it here. Okay. So plan of the seminar, like we are in the first session, like cognitive mapping and the Althusserian cut or cognitive break, so to speak. We'll be talking about Jameson and the concept of cognitive mapping and preparing the problem space, so to speak, the division between science and ideology for Althusser, the fact that cognitive mapping seems to be the purview of science, but at the same time, for Jameson, it is the purview of ideology. So how do we solve that? What kind of solution we have from this, which seems like a contradiction between them? So it corresponds to the session 2 and 3 of that paper, like cognitive mapping, a different kind of imbalance, of course, the Jamesonian part and the function of ideology, and also the function of theoretical practice for Althusser, right? So we'll be dealing basically Althusser and Jameson today, more Jameson than Althusser though, because I'll leave most of the Althusser material for the third session, like in detail, okay? Second session, Sellars between fact and description, as the title says, like, corresponds to the Sellarsian sessions of that paper. And we'll be dealing basically with a bunch of Sellars texts because, I mean, a seminar like this has like many different people coming from many different backgrounds. So I really feel we have to have like a good grasp of what Sellars is about. So for the Salesians, this might be a little bit kind of boring because they already know it, but many people who are interested in Marxism don't know Sellars. So this is the point of having a whole session for that. So we'll be reading a couple of texts. The good news is for those who already follow my seminars, I won't be reading like some reflections on language games again. So at least I varied the texts. So we'll be reading different Sellars texts from the ones that we already tackled in previous seminars. Although for those who don't know Sellars, maybe it would be good to also tackle some of those texts because those are really central. For instance, the philosophy of the scientific image of man, like it's like a basic text for the difference between the manifest and the scientific image. Okay. Third session will be Althusser, basically, and corresponds to the fifth to the fifth session of that presentation. And then we'll kind of flesh out what we'll be gesturing at today on Althusser, like actually reading other texts. Today we'll focus on chapter 6 for Marx on the materials called on materialist dialectic. Just a little bit. We won't read the whole text today, but then in the third session we'll relate that text to some of the materials that are in reading capital, with an eye to the Giannotti's alternative that we'll be tackling in the fourth session. In the fourth session, we'll be reading 3 different Giannotti's texts. One of them is already translated. You can have a taste of Giannotti, those who are not Portuguese speakers, by reading the Contra Althusser translation that I prepared. But we'll also be reading like different, there's a kind of an arch to the way he builds basically his concept of real abstraction out of his critique of Althusser. Basically, his critique of Althusser is that Althusser is not able to countenance real abstraction, which means in our framework, Althusser has a limited space for the constraining role of language. Like here, we'll talk about 2 different roles to language, and language is like can be modulated as science and as ideology. So language is not on the side of either science or ideology exclusively. So in a certain sense, like it can function as science and as ideology, right? Uh, so in a sense, like language has a representing role, which is part of cognitive mapping, of course. It's like the central question of cognitive mapping. But at the same time, language has a constraining role. So the very structures the language is describing has to do with the fact that the language we speak and the kind of, which means the presuppositions we carry in the social world are what shape this world itself that language is describing. So there's kind of a bind there. that in the Althusserian picture will be divided between science and ideology in the Giannotti alternative. The very abstractions we use in science have kind of a genetic constitution within the social world itself, within everyday language use, and we'll be talking about that in the fourth session. Okay, so this is the basic gist of the seminar. I know again, like use a lot of technical terms right at the start because I mean we need to constitute the problem space of the seminar. But don't worry, this will be fleshed out along the way, and the problem space itself, I hope it will be like properly constituted and understood by everybody. Hopefully by the end of the session, so we can actually kind of navigate the different paths that come out of this problem space, okay, in the next sessions. Um, here's like the Marx quote that Gabriel was reading. I mean, the full Marx quote. This is here just to motivate the problem, like the problem for political economy. What is it that what is the role of abstractions, and what is it like a kind of a science, or is it like its function is ideological, which will be part of the discussion here in the seminar. So this is why the quote is there, and I'll read it real quickly. Like, the population is an abstraction if I leave out, for example, the classes of which it is composed. These classes in turn are an empty phrase if I'm not familiar with the elements on which they rest, e.g. wage, labor, capital, etc. These later in turn presuppose exchange, division of labor, prices, etc. For example, capital is nothing without wage labor, without value, money, price, and etc. Thus, if I were to begin with the population, this would be a chaotic conception, translation of Vorstellung here, of the whole. And I would then, by means of further determination, move analytically towards ever more simple concepts from the imagined concrete towards ever thinner abstractions until I had arrived at the simplest determinations. From there, the journey would have to be retraced until I had finally arrived at the population again, but this time not as the chaotic conception of a whole, but as a rich totality of many determinations and relations. The concrete is concrete because it is the concentration of many determinations, hence, unity of the diverse. It appears in the process of thinking, therefore, as a process of concentration, as a result, not as a point of departure, even though it is the point of departure in reality, and hence also the point of departure for observation and conception. So here, like, we have like a bunch of like, this is super rich, like it's a bunch of very interesting things. Whenever we see like those kinds of vulgar Marxists kind of saying like, we are for concretion, everything has to be concrete, and we are for reality and materiality, blah blah blah. You have to remind them that a concretion in the Marxist sense should be the reproduction in thought of the forces that are material forces that are out there, and these material forces can only be reproduced through the concentration of many kinds of abstractions. So the abstraction is a function of Marxist science here, like very, very centrally. And another important element of this, therefore, like the idea is to reproduce a certain determined whole and a determined movement that can be retraced out of this observed whole. And this is why I'm saying like this totality, this observed totality, is also a point against Hegel here. Like, some people, I mean, Althusser makes a point of honor to read this as a paragraph that is polemizing against the Hegelian conception of totality unfolded through thinking alone, which is, I think, not a very good, actually, interpretation of Hegel. But anyway, this is kind of the historical element, the historical kind of crux that Althusser is speaking against Hegel, and this is a good way to a good place to start and to understand it. And this kind of anti-Hegelian polemic you can localize in the end of the quote where he says like concrete is concrete because it's a concentration of many determinations, which is like perfectly Hegelian phrase. It appears in the process of thinking, therefore, as a process of concentration, as a result, not as a point of departure. So this is the basic issue. If we read Science of Logic, it seemed like the Hegelian unfolding comes about, the Hegelian unfolding of reality as such comes about through the unfolding of the thought abstractions or the logical abstractions themselves. The logic unfolds itself and making the world appear as such. For the Marxian point of view, these unfoldings are independent of any kind of thought or independent of any kind of Geist in the Hegelian sense. And what we ought to do is to retrace their genesis through an act of observation and conceptualization through these abstractions of what is observed, reconstituting the complexity of this concrete through the abstractions we employ to make it manifest for us, I would say. Okay. Any questions till now? Very simple questions too. It's okay. Nope. So I'll move forward. So and then we will go direct to the Althusserian kind of understanding of this process that will give us one of the elements of the problem space that I want to tackle in this seminar, which is the difference between science and ideology. We won't be fleshing out this difference fully today, but we'll have like the basic gist of it. We'll fully flesh them out in the third session after we have like the manifest and scientific image in Sellars in the second session. Okay, but today we'll already have the duality of science and ideology in mind. As like the Althusserian understanding of this Marxian method of political economy. Okay, so what Althusser has to say about this, Althusser in the text that I sent for this first session, which is on the materials dialectic, he has this concept of theoretical practice. So theoretical practice is one kind of practice among practices, and as all practice, it works on a material through a certain set of techniques and make this material take out of this material a result, something that is the result of the theoretical practice. So he thinks of theoretical practice as a kind of a mode of production in a certain sense, where you have like the prime materials, the technique, technology, technique, and machinery, and the end result in a certain sense. And what are basically the materials? What is the technique, and what is the end result? Is what he's in the first part of this essay is trying to get at. So he's talking about theoretical practice in that sense, falls within the general definition of practice. It works on a raw material, representations, concepts, and facts, which is given by other practices, whether empirical, technical, or ideological. In its most general form, theoretical practice does not only include scientific theoretical practice, but also pre-scientific theoretical practice, that is, ideological theoretical practice, the forms of knowledge that make up the prehistory of a science and their philosophies. Here, he's also very influenced by French epistemology. He's basically like he's not only a Marxist, but he's also very much influenced by Bachelard, by their conception of science, which we'll also tackle more thoroughly in the third session to understand like the epistemological break, why is it that science is so different from ideology and all of that. But first, to have like an intuitive grasp of these relations, we'll just follow Althusser here. So to include scientific theoretical practice, but also pre-scientific theoretical practice, that is ideological theoretical practice, the forms of knowledge that make up the prehistory of a science and their philosophies. The theoretical practice of a science is always completely distinct from the ideological theoretical practice of its prehistory. Here I'm putting in on green and red because like this will be kind of the crux of the issue of the following my color code, crux of the disagreement between Giannotti and Althusser, and this will be between the third and fourth session. Will be tackled too. This distinction takes the form of a qualitative, theoretical, and historical discontinuity, which I shall follow Bachelard in calling an epistemological break. So what are the consequences of the epistemological break? This will be also third or fourth session. This is not the place to discuss the dialectic in action in the advent of this break. That is a labor of specific theoretical transformation, which installs it in each case, which establishes a science by detaching it from the ideology of its past and by revealing this past as ideological. Okay. The concept of ideology here is also kind of tricky. We will have like a very, very fantastic text by William Clare Roberts on the third session that kind of retraces the history of the concept of ideology within the Marxist tradition. The point here is that the ideology is not science. This is the first point and first intuitive point. Like ideology, it seems like naive kind of understanding, or if it was a science at once, is now like a naive or immediate, so to speak, understanding of a certain kind of field or object. Okay, so we need like scientific objects that are more adequate to its objects, and to have them, you have to break with this naive understanding of this field. This would be like the intuitive understanding of ideology here. Of course, there is a very specific Althusserian understanding of ideology that we'll get to when we start talking about Jameson and the way he understands it. Okay. So, what is the theoretical object of theoretical practice then for Althusser? The first generality, which I shall call generality 1, constitutes the raw material that the science's theoretical practice will transform into specified concepts, that is, into that other concrete generality, which I shall call generality 3, which is a knowledge. But what then is generality 1? That is the raw material on which the labor of science is expended. The labor of science that is expended corresponds here is not in the quote, but it corresponds to generality 2. So you have like the labor of generality 2 on generality 1 generating generality 3, which is the new science. Okay. Contrary to the ideological illusions which are not naive, not mere aberrations, but necessary and well-founded as ideologies of empiricism and sensualism, science never works on an existence whose essence is pure immediacy and singularity. This is a very, I should have put that in blue because this is a very important, it kind of justifies the project. This is a very important coincidence agreement between Althusser and Sellars. Like in Sellars, we'll be talking about the critique of the given, basically, and the idea that there is something given, immediate, is like an object of critique by Sellars, and but also here by Althusser, like a science does not work on a given sensuous object; it works on a kind of a conception, pre-existing conception of that, if it in the case it is a sensuous object, of that pre-existing conception of that sensuous object in a certain sense, and that conception can be of many natures, can be even religious nature, mythic nature, or a previous science, previous existing science, scientific, of a previous existing scientific nature. Okay, so the working through these conceptions through generality to the science of the day will make appear new concepts. It's like it's a theoretical practice in a certain sense is the fashioning of new concepts adequate to its objects, making them a new science out of a preconception. When I mentioned in the last slide that ideology was somehow naive or immediate, it's like naivety and immediacy that is historical, which means it becomes something that was the result of a previous, right, a previous elaboration becomes then a second nature, and therefore becomes kind of naive or immediate in that sense, becomes like part of the intuitive grasp of everyday life in a certain sense. So it doesn't mean that you have access to the thing as given beyond any kind of preconception you might have. It only means that you have like a given in the sense of a preconceived uh, idea of that given that is already in circulation, so to speak. Okay, so it always works on something general, even if this has the form of a fact. At his moment of constitution, as for physics with Galileo, and for the science of the evolution of social formations, historical materialism with Marx, a science always works on existing concepts, Vorstellungen, that is a preliminary generality one of an ideological nature. It does not work on a purely objective given, that of pure and absolute facts. On the contrary, its particular labor consists of elaborating its own scientific facts through a critique of the ideological facts elaborated by an earlier ideological theoretical practice. Okay, to elaborate its own specific facts is simultaneously to elaborate its own theory, since a scientific fact and not the self-styled pure phenomenon, the given, can only be identified in the field of a theoretical practice. In the development of an already constituted science, the latter works on a raw material, generality one, constituted either of still ideological concepts or, as I was saying before, of scientific facts of already scientifically elaborated concepts which belong, nevertheless, to an earlier phase of a science, an X generality 3. So this was a former generality 3, generality 3 that was it was once a generality 3 to become like now a generality 1. So it is by transforming this generality 1 into a generality 3, which is knowledge or scientific knowledge, that the science works and produces. So this is his conception of science that has a few very interesting consequences. First, you don't work on a given, like I was mentioning. You work on preconceived materials, and preconceived materials mean like they already passed through the work of conception of an earlier generality 3 or of an ideological kind of conception, uh, which is really interesting. Second point, when it says like a science elaborates its own specific facts, this might be problematic because then what are is the fact elaborated by science the same as the fact elaborated previously? Like where is the object of the specific science? Where does it lies? Does the object lies on the side of the science or on the side of the pre-scientific field that is to be explained by the said science? You see, so there is a problem of reference here. What is the reference of the scientific practice, since he says that the scientific practice elaborates its own facts? So what kind of nature, what is the nature of the relationship between the fact elaborated through science that is a new fact, therefore, and the fact that is the fact to be explained by said science? So there's a problem of the reference connection, the connection of reference between the practice and social world as at large. A question here in the chat: is it fair to draw a parallel between the preconceptions through which we approach things and the Kantian categories? Yes, there is a parallel there, and the parallel is, I think, clearer in Sellars than in Althusser, because Sellars is an avowed Kantian, while Althusser is not. But the problem is like the Kantian categories are non-historical, right? Like there is like this composition of the transcendental subject, and you can't really devise new categories out of those one. You have those one compose the transcendental subject, and that's all there is to it. So what even Sellars, as an avowed Kantian, is also trying to do is try to historicize these categories. So this is one of the interesting this is one of the interesting relations one can draw between like Sellars and Marx too, like the fact that cognition has a history and the categories have also history for Sellars. So with that caveat, of course, these are kind of tantamount to content categories, like the ways we conceptualize the objects that are constituted. I won't say given, are constituted in experience. Okay, we could say given with the proviso that we understand the given only in a kind of simplified sense, that is that which is independent of my own spontaneity. It's like that which is comes from outside, so to speak. But coming from outside, it does not carry with it its own its own conceptualization. Its conceptualization are the work of, for Kant, the transcendental subject, for Sellars and for Althusser, collective practice of science making, so to speak, or of ideological practice of certain sort. So the social world is also, this is a second difference. In Kant, you have like ahistorical, so to speak, arguably ahistorical understanding of the categories, but also arguably an asocial understanding of the categories. So this would be also kind of, I think, a second caveat that we have to bring to bear on the Kantian categories for them to work more more akin to what we are talking here about Althusser and what we will be talking soon about Sellars. Okay, does that answer your question, Julia?
It does. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question. Very good. Um, yeah. So here's like his nice. This is kind of rare, I think. Somebody sent this to me. It's only in the French edition, one of the French editions of the for Lenin, the Lenian philosophy. Sorry, Lenin de la philosophie, which has like this essay on Hegel. For Althusser, like there's this like nice little diagram of theoretical practice. It's in French. The English and both the English and the Brazilian Portuguese translations don't preserve it. I don't understand why. It's rather nice, and it kind of gives an example of what we're talking, right? G1 is generality one, matière première théorique, like the first theoretical, materials. So he's doing this for Marx. So what is Marx as G3, as the theoretical product, right? So he's like working through the first G1, which is Ricardo and French socialism, basically political economy as it existed before, and utopian socialist thought, right? And les instruments de production théorique, like G2, the instruments of theoretical production, which is Hegel, funny enough, for Althusser, like Hegel is brought to bear on that first G1, and that gives us like the critique of political economy that Marx is proposing, like as a G1 G2 acting over G1 to produce G3. So these like a concrete example, just because of that. That I brought this is kind of a nice example, and it's also an interesting moment where Althusser is like also giving Hegel its due in a certain sense in the process of the constitution of Marxist science. Anyway, which is you will see it's not always the case. So here I'll just again with an eye to constituting the problem space of the seminar is a very quick Sellarsian like proviso, like the Sellarsian difference between the manifest and scientific images. And these differences that have like just checking the time, have like canonical spots where they appear. Okay, of course there is like the famous text that I mentioned, Philosophy in the Scientific Image of Man, where like this is the actual object of the text and of the concept of the conceptual effort of that essay. But you can find in Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind, Sellars' most famous text, like two different spots where you can see what is the basic, just the basic element of the manifest image and the basic element of the scientific image. So what is like the first one, the manifest image, like usually we give like this paragraph 36 as the characterization of it. It's not clear for the non-Salesians why is it that this is a manifest image. What is manifest here? Like, what is a manifest image? For Sellars, the manifest image is our current self-conception. What is interesting also in Sellars, like you have like a current self-conception, which is the manifest image. In philosophy and the scientific image of the world, he characterizes the manifest image as some form of previous scientific image, pretty much as Althusser is saying, like about previous kind of ideological formations that used to be a scientific formation, used to be like a novel kind of conceptualization of a certain field of experience or action or whatever. So the manifest image is for Sellars the place where humanity come to understand itself through the resources of the perennial philosophical tradition. It's like we have like the concept of a self-determined autonomous subject or rational subject as a result of this historical process of conceptualizing ourselves in that sense. And there is this there's a word missing here I wanted to use earlier. Uh, anyway, there is this common element between Althusser and Sellars, but there's also this different element, which is the fact that in Sellars there is this the self-conception is a self-conception of the subject in a certain sense. So here in the manifest image is the manifest image of man in the world. It's not only the manifest image of the world, right? Even though the manifest image of man in the world carries with it a certain manifest image of the world as correlated to these manifest conception of man in the world. Why is it that is manifest? Because it corresponds to our kind of phenomenology in a certain sense, because it became second nature in a certain sense. It is the product of a historical process, but it becomes naturalized as second nature, so to speak. So becomes manifest, like the ontology of molar objects and of people is like the ontology where we live in, so to speak. So this would be like a manifest image. But then the quote does not say anything about that. The quote in EPM here is like just a quote about what is an episode of knowledge. And why is it that this quote is important? And how does this quote connect to what I'm saying about the manifest image or about the space of reasons? So he says, in characterizing an episode or a state as that of knowing, we are not giving an empirical description of that episode or state. When you say like, this is an episode of knowing, the sentence, I don't know, water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius. Like uh, this is a knowledge. When we say this is a knowledge, we are not saying that, we're not giving an empirical description of that, of what that sentence is saying. We are placing it in the logical space of reasons, of justifying and being able to justify what one says. Which means, if I'm saying like something is an episode of knowledge, I'm saying that it is inferentially connected to other episodes. So knowledge means we need to justify whatever is a candidate to knowledge, which means also that there are inferential. This is tricky to understand, but right now, but I'll give just a preliminary understanding, which means that the concepts we use are inferentially laden, which means like we use water as if it froze in 0 degrees. We use the concept of water as if it froze in 0 degrees. This is not part of the descriptive. It's not just something you gather from watching water, seeing water, or taking a shower or anything like that. It is an inferential element that is connected to the concept of water, and therefore we have this previous understanding of what water is. So this is in a sense, for Sellars, we live then in the space of reasons. So the space of reasons is basically that inferentially articulated totality where each piece of knowledge is inferentially connected to other pieces of knowledge. And this has a certain traction in the critique of the given, therefore, because the given does not carry by itself its influential connections. It needs the workings of a language, linguistic articulation to connect pieces of information into this, let's say like we could say like coherentist kind of whole or totality. That is the space of reasons, and the the different images, the manifest image is carries with it such a conception, the conception that uh, this vindicates the idea that the manifest image is not given or it's not natural, but it's naturalized, which is fairly different here. Therefore, the manifest image is the constitution of such a space of reasons, okay? And therefore, you have like the minimal distance between the given and the conceptions that we have of the world through these kind of inferentially laden concepts that we use, okay? So in a sense, why is it that I'm connecting these quotes to the manifest image? I'm connecting it because it vindicates the idea that that there is like a succession of images, and also that there is minimal distance between given and the way the given gets conceptualized within a certain space of reason. Okay. And the second quote, in the dimension of describing and explaining the world, science is the measure of all things, of what it is that it is, and what it is not that it is not. So these two quotes are this is what we call the ciencia mensura principle in Sellars, it's like the scientific realism. So Sellars has like this duality within what his thought, like he's like a social pragmatist, linguistic pragmatist on one side, but he's also a scientific realist on the other side. And here you have like the tension between the manifest and scientific images. And here we also have the tension of what the tradition, the post-Sellars tradition, called left and right Sellars. It has nothing to do with politics. It's just like a way to describe by making a reference to 19th century left and right Hegelians, right? So you have left Sellarians are those interested in the resources of the space of reasons, of the social space of reasons. For instance, Richard Rorty would be like the most greater example of that. Like there's no objective reality to be spoken of. It's just like our discursive practices and stuff like that. And Robert Brandon would be, in my view, more subtle example of that too, in the sense that he's not upholding scientific realism. He's upholding, yes, science, but within this linguistic socialized space. So this is kind of left Salesianism. Right Salesianism basically develops the dimension of the scientific realism of Sellars. So the examples would be like the Churchlands, for instance. The idea of the eliminativist materialism comes downstream of the teachings of Sellars. To a point that in the case of eliminative materialism, I won't be able to develop this here, but maybe we can talk a little bit more about it in the end of the session, to the point that for eliminative materialism, the space of reasons is something to be jettisoned. So you have like this tension. Sellars wants to have both socialized linguistic space at the same time as scientific realism, and scientific realism here means he will take seriously the entities that science talks about. So if science talks about and is able to make predictions with its scientific objects, here the resonance with Althusser, the idea of the constitution of the scientific fact, is not trivial. Sellars thinks we have to uphold these objects or facts as real, right? And then for Sellars, you have, as we will see in the next session, you have like this tension between these two images and the way the scientific image tends to supersede the manifest image, therefore, as an Althusserian would say, a new kind of generality. But the problem is that you can't really retrieve all the elements of the manifest image in a one by one or in an isomorphic form in the scientific image. For instance, you can't, for Sellars at the time he's writing, you can't really have a concept of the subject. within the scientific image as we have in the manifest image. So this is one of the problems. And if this subject with its own kind of forms of reasoning gave rise to the scientific image, it seems as if the scientific image is destroying its own ground by not being able to provide a scientific concept of the subject. This is for Sellars. Althusser just accepts that science has no subject in that sense. Let me see, there is something on the chat. State of non-internal nature. Yeah, I think that's a question for later. And also, I would ask you to also flesh out the question better, because I don't understand really what does it mean. Logical construction versus materialist computation. Like, what is the difference between these in the question itself? So I'll have to understand the question better to be able to answer it. Okay. Okay, I'll read the question just have it on our belt. Perhaps it's a question for later. From what I understood, the space of reconstruction, going from the essential object to abstraction, deriving insight from external operations, transformations, interactions, and then back again to the real object, is also where either science or ideology provides us with method. But, sorry. But the granularity is something I'm struggling with. There exists a meta level, i.e. method of producing method, and higher levels ad infinitum. However, the set of, let's say, mental computation, whether used in science of our ideology, that allows the reconstructive act is still, in a sense, immanent. Okay, we go from one state of knowing to another, and each of those steps is observably finite. That seems to be a Zeno's paradox, like logical construction versus materialist computation type issue, in perhaps my conception of reconstruction. Yeah, I can start answering that, at least in the sense like that. It's not sure to me that you need a meta level in the sense of a separate meta level from the levels that are being engaged in. Like a meta level here is like, the meta level here would be the generality to itself in a certain sense. The meta level is provided by the relationship between the levels being connected in a certain sense. So the meta level is not something that we have beforehand, but it's something that appears through the relationship between the levels. This is super, super abstract, but I think Giannotti will help us understand that. So I would take, I don't necessarily agree with the idea that there is a problem of an infinite recursion problem of sorts here, since meta level is not something specifically and rigid and determined as a role played by a set of conceptual tools. So that role can change, like what is playing that role can change historically. So this is why I don't feel that the meta level is really like a meta level in the sense of being separate from what the materials of each level are. They can exercise the function of that you are assigning to the meta level in a certain sense, while being still, of course, a current form of science, so to speak. This is what I would say provisionally to that question. And we can talk about it later. I would like to understand then what is the difference between logical construction and materialist computation in the way that you are understanding. Does that at least start to answer?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Yeah, that makes sense.
Thank you for the question. Thank you. Okay. Just also, okay, 1 hour in already. Okay. Okay, so this gives us the problem of that I was talking about, and it has to do with the question actually. Problem of cognizing and constraining at the same time, like this things we use to cognize or represent also constrain our representings and constrain our dealings with reality. So the language we speak and the preconception we have, for instance, in the Sellarian picture of ourselves, of course, they constrain what we think a human as a candidate concept can do. So it's not idle. The fact that we're not talking from the God's point of view or of an or place. We are talking from the place of the concrete dealings with language and theoretical reason and class relations, and you have it. So the fact is there is a problem there of conceptualizing entails also constraining, being constrained back by how things are conceptualized in a certain sense. So you have like almost like not separate meta levels, but just to address the question again in the terms of the question, this kind of helps. You have like this collapse between levels in a certain sense, which is always already going on. But we are always already also, it seems to me, creating the difference between the level and the meta level in the functional sense, so to speak. So now, even if we are constrained by this set of understandings, we are using this set of understandings as a certain method to read through these other, let us say, raw materials. Okay. So here this is myself. It is striking to see in Althusser's account a very close proximity with the Sellarian picture of the transformation of the manifest image into the scientific image. While per the critique of the given, one does not access reality in itself, but always collectively elaborating to a certain form of consciousness. Different images are produced through the elaboration of different sets of experimentation and conceptualization, the succession of which is understood by Sellars as bottoming out in the successive constitution of the scientific image out of the manifest image, what he calls images of many in the world. So this is like, I'm comparing vocabulary here, and comparing like what is interesting in the similarity. What are the interesting similarities between Althusser and Sellars? But also, this is a Marxian quote. It is not the consciousness of man that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness. So this is a problem of constraining, right? For Marxian science, this is crucial. It's not you don't theorize from nowhere. You theorize from your class, position or your historical moment and all that. And this has constraints in it that comes from the state of the social being determining consciousness. So Althusser thinks the elaboration of theoretical objects out of ideological ones. In that sense, he thinks of the cognizing abstraction, the path that comes from social structure as object to theory. What about the converse path? And this is green because this will be Giannotti's point against Althusser. If social being determines consciousness, there must have a causal nexus that goes from social form as a constraint to the categories used for theorization. Here too, again, we are also connecting to a previous question, Julia's question about Kant. And my answer was that we need to socialize and historicize the categories. So this is exactly where we are. Like, yes, Kant is right in the sense that we need categories to conceptualize experience. So it's not just the sensible by itself. But Kant is not right in the sense that he thinks he's able to describe that once and for all as the composition of the transcendental subject. And those have to be socialized and historicized to have like a more robust and correct understanding of how they function. Okay, I'm just bringing these to bear on the previous question so we can advance our understanding here better. Like Felipe, can you elaborate on that? I don't understand. I'll read it before, and then you can unmute yourself because I really want to understand that. I'm getting the impression Althusser is being somehow classicist, whereas Sellars is not, in how the former strongly divides the manifest and scientific image and the latter models their interpenetration. Classicist in what? In the sense like elitist, or what? In this classical, in the
No,
classical
no,
logic
elitist,
sense? Or
classist, at least in the European Portuguese, to be classista means to abide by a strong social division, you know. And
okay, so being
I get,
elitist, yeah, yeah.
yeah, being an elitist, I get the impression that at least possibly involuntarily, Althusser is closing the scientific image in the ivory tower, and Giannotti, in the green highlighted
Mm-hmm.
question, I think Giannotti will ask Althusser, well, maybe you're forgetting that science is not that closed off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You're correct, I think. Yeah, I would agree with that. I wouldn't say necessarily elitist, but yeah, it's a good provocation. I'll think about that. But yeah, I think the forms that these duality take in both thinkers, there's this basic difference. Like in Sellars, and Giannotti helps us see that. Giannotti is not Salesian, but we can bring what Giannotti does as a criticism of Althusser to bear on this comparison between Sellars and Althusser. In Sellars itself, it's kind of processual and historical. There's like this kind of description of this processual character that is, even if Sellars is not the best Hegelian in the Pittsburgh bunch, is more like a Kantian guy than a Hegelian one. But there's this element of Hegelianism in a certain sense built in. Whereas in Althusser, you get the sense that everything is kind of tightly separated, and then the processual character of this production of generalities, for me, at least as my own position regarding these thinkers, maybe somebody else will disagree. Is more segregated, and for me, it's more difficult to understand how is it that G3 comes about, if you like, and it gives rise of the as to questions as the last one, for instance, like the meta level, because they appear as so separated from each other, right? Whereas in Sellars, this is not the case, and in Giannotti, his criticism of Althusser basically it makes us prone to upholding real abstraction as having its origin in social life and being something that eventually give rise to the scientific forms of abstraction we use to understand things, which is, for those who know me, also a Zonnetelian point, but we are not talking Zonnettel in this seminar. So finally, so that was like previous problem space. We had like the science and ideology pair. We have like manifest and scientific image pair. What else? We have the problem of abstraction and the origin of abstraction. Is it in social life? Is it scientific abstraction? Which the Marx quote gives us, and Giannotti will develop. We have like a bunch of problems already, and we have the question. The question is like, what Marx wants to do. Is it like a science? It seems like a science of history, material history through its abstractions. At the same time, here with the Jameson, we will motivate the concept of cognitive mapping in the way he put it seminally in his cognitive mapping paper, but also the fact that he thinks cognitive mapping is to be done by art. So that's a kind of a problem. So this will kind of complexify the problem space. We'll get to this. Sorry, damn. We'll get to this eventually. Figuration between art and science. Figuration between experience and concept, the blue one, which is Sellars' problem. Figuration between science and ideology, which is the red one, which is Althusser's problem. figuration between cognizing and constraining green one, which is Giannotti's problem. And the white one is just like, we are talking art today and only today because of Jameson. Like, why is it that art will do cognitive mapping? This is weird. Anyway, yeah, I spot already an error here. Like, this is from the PDF, and sometimes they kind of do this like JJ, it's will, of course. Anyway, sorry. Most of these I corrected, but yeah, that escaped me. So here's the quote. Art has always done a great many different things and had a great many distinct and incommensurable functions. Let it continue to do all of that, which it will in any case, even in utopia. So he's not saying like art has to be didactic, but he's saying like there is a kind of he introduces a problem by saying there is a neglected didactic element to art. But the very pluralism of the aesthetic suggests that there should be nothing particularly repressive in the attempt to remind ourselves and to revive experimentally one traditional function of the aesthetic that has in our time been peculiarly neglected and marginalized, if not interdicted altogether. To teach, to move, to delight of these traditional formulations of the uses of work of art, the first has virtually been eclipsed from contemporary criticism and theory. Yet the pedagogical function of a work of art seems in various forms to have been an inescapable parameter of any conceivable Marxist aesthetic, if a few others. And it is the great historical merit of the work of Darko Suvin to repeatedly insist on a more contemporary formulation of this aesthetic value in the suggestive slogan of the cognitive, which I have made my own today. So sorry about the typos. Usually after the session I send the slides for you. I'll have these corrected. I think the other ones are already corrected. Forgot this one. So he has to justify himself, like why is it that he's suggesting art have to have like this didactic function. In a certain sense, I understand that art has a didactic function for Jameson. I think this will be clear because it's a problem of representation, yes, but it's not a problem of just scientific representation. It's a problem of circulating information as cognitive mapping. So in the essay, he talks about, ways to circulate, for instance, certain political experiments. He mentions a film done by a political collective in the US. And the idea is to kind of circulate in a communicable form their political experiment in a certain sense. So for Jameson, in a certain sense, cognitive mapping has also a kind of an immediate political function, and to have an immediate political function, paradoxically, is to engage in ideology, not only in science here. And ideology in the very Althusserian sense, which is the imaginary. Here I give finally the kind of definite quote, which is the imaginary relationship of subjects to the social whole. So it's not just as Marx would have it in the first quote, the constitution of this social whole through the scientific abstractions, but the relationship between the individual and the social whole, which is ideology for Althusser. I think this is a very tricky, in my opinion, very tricky definition. We'll have much to talk about relating to this in the third session, because ideology is not only that, but this is kind of the canonical definition, like an imaginary relation in a certain sense. For me, ideology in Althusser is a material thing. But anyway, we'll have time for that in the third session and with the William Clare Roberts text, which delves into that. So Jameson, again, they introduced then this problem of representation. What is the didactic function of art then? What makes it didactic? It has to represent something, figure something, right? Show something to be the case, so to speak. So this is the didactic function. And this is perhaps the moment I read to warn you that I tend to use the charged word representation in a different way than it has consistently been used in post-structuralist or post-Marxist theory, namely as a synonym of some bad ideological or organic realism or mirage of realistic unification. For me, representation is rather the synonym of figuration itself, irrespective of the latter's historical and ideological form. I assume, therefore, in what follows, that all forms of aesthetic production consist, in one way or another, in the struggle with and for representation, and this whether they are perspectival or trompe-l'oeil illusions, or the most reflexive and diacritical iconoclastic or form-breaking modernisms. So at least in my language, the call for new kinds of representation is not meant to imply the return to Balzac or Brecht, nor is it intended as some valorization of content over form, yet another archaic distinction I still feel is indispensable and about which I will have more to say shortly. So yeah, of course, the issue of art is also because it's what Jameson does as a theorist of literature, and the quote makes it very clear. But anyway, he's a theorist of literature that insists on the figuration and of retracing the breakings of form in literary form to the difficulties, to the hardships of representing. And representing what? Representing totality for him. We'll get to that in a controlled and based manner. So he suggests there are three stages of capitalist space, actually, not the capitalist accumulation or two, but capitalist space are, he has like this spatial conception. He suggests there are three stages, and these three stages offer different kind of challenges. From the second stage on, you have like the representation challenge. That is what motivates the problem of cognitive mapping. So I quote, have tried to suggest that these three historical stages of capital have each generated a type of space unique to it, even though these three stages of capitalist space are obviously far more profoundly interrelated than are the spaces of other modes of production. The three types of space I have in mind are all the result of discontinuous expansions or quantum leaps in the enlargement of capital, in the latest penetration and colonization of hitherto uncommodified areas. So it has to do in a very kind of literal sense with the expansion, geographical expansion also of capital, and also with the restructuring of capital, of its topology, so to speak. So space here is also understood in an extensive sense, in an intensive sense also of the distribution within the world of capital, of the reconfiguration of the mode of production too. So first stage, classical or market capital. I have tried to describe the first kind of space of classical or market capitalism in terms of a logic of the grid, a reorganization of some older, sacred, and heterogeneous space into geometrical and Cartesian homogeneity, a space of infinite equivalence and extension of which you can find a kind of dramatic or emblematic shorthand representation in Foucault's book on prisons. The example, however, requires a warning that a Marxian view of such space grounds it in Taylorization and the labor process rather than in that shadowy and mythical Foucault entity called power. So this corresponds to modernity, like classical market capital, the creed, in some sense. For us who are familiar with, John Hattel, for instance, he has like a great way to describe the way that the greed comes about through the commodity form, in the sense of, there existing a kind of social practices that makes it so that there's an equivalence, a non-empirical equivalence between qualitatively different objects come about through the exchange abstraction. So the emergence of value in capital as a first stage of market capitalism is something that enables us to think of equivalence in general. So the grid, the kind of organization pertaining to the grid would correspond to this kind of homogenization through value in a certain sense. And I was going to say something else about this. Yeah, and also being like the form of capital that is characteristic of modernity, it also, like, if we believe the Zorn-Hattelian kind of thesis, it also begets, Galilean science, so to speak. So the capacity to, and this also connects to our problem of the constraining and cognizing functions of language. So there is like a social being or a social practice at place of exchange abstractions that makes it so that different elements are treated as equivalents and measured in terms of, their monetary value, that makes it so that it is thinkable, that you can extract from a phenomenologically differentiated space, homogeneously equivalent and striated space, so to speak. So in a certain sense, this is like the first figure, like of this first stage of classical and market capitalism. Jameson does not develop here a problem of representation. The cognitive mapping, the necessity of cognitive mapping only comes into place with the second phase. So the second stage of capital, monopoly capital, and the phenomenological gap, what I'm calling the phenomenological gap. So here he said, like, the problems of figuration that concerns us will only become visible in the next stage, the passage from markets to monopoly capital, or what Lenin called the stage of imperialism. And they may be conveyed by way of a growing contradiction between lived experience, and this is kind of very, very kind of crucial to our seminar, and this is the basic problem. Finally, a growing contradiction between lived experience and structure, or between a phenomenological description of the life of an individual and a more properly structural model of the conditions of existence of that experience. Too rapidly, we can say there are a bunch of typos still. Sorry, I did it like in a hurry, just getting the relevant quotes for this session. I'll correct it and send it corrected to you guys. So properly structural model of the condition of existence of that experience. Too rapidly, we can say that while in older societies and perhaps even in the early stages of market capital, the immediate and limited experience of individuals is still able to encompass and coincide with the true economic and social form that governs that experience. In the next moment, these two levels drift ever further apart and really begin to constitute themselves into that opposition the classical dialectic describes as Wesen and Erscheinung, like essence and, it says essence and appearance, structure and lived experience. So the problem is like there is a drift between what is visible from the individual experiential point of view, or phenomenological, if we want, in a certain concept of phenomenology, and the structural complexity, complex determination of that experience in certain sense. So in monopoly capital, the idea is that, let us say, experience and structure drift apart, or experience and the world, the complexity of the capitalist world drift apart. So we don't have like a ready transitivity between what one is able to experience in one's own life and the complexity, like the fact that the tea that I'm having come from such and such and such countries, so such and such chains of supply, and there you go. Like the world is way bigger than the domestic space of experience in a certain sense. So this starts motivating the problem of cognitive mapping in the sense of retrieving this world complexity to make it fit in a certain sense, to look, not to make it fit our experience, but to locate our experience within this complexity. And it is very clearly, I think, connected to the problem, the scientific problem of political economy in a certain sense. So instead of having like a chaotic conception of totality, science usually would have to reconstruct this complexity through thinner abstractions that make this complexity determined. It's not a chaotic totality anymore, but it's a determined type of totality. But here, Jameson is adding one more twist to the problem, which is the fact that our experience, so we can see already in Marx maybe the anxiety of retrieving such a complexity from the point of view of the cognitive individual in a certain sense. But in Jameson, this cognitive individual is part of the picture in a very explicit way. And the problem of understanding the determination of individual experience from a structure that is not of the same scale of that individual experience makes it so that cognitive mapping can be understood in a certain way here as a mediation through the concept by which the individual experience can make itself compossible to this structural complexity, to the scale of the structural complexity in a certain sense. So this is cognitive mapping in a sense. This is a basic problem. There's a comment here on the chat. I think it's a comment, right? I'll read it by Diego. Is Diego? Yeah, Diego. Thinking about the emergence of value as this space of difference equivalence that you show us was remembering a take from Marx in Capital Volume 1, of course, where he says, the secret of the expression of value, namely that all kinds of labor are equal and equivalent because and so far as they are human labor in general, cannot be deciphered until the notion of the human equality has already acquired the fixity of a popular prejudice. So was thinking in this paradoxical thing about theoretical abstractions. They depend on social constraining, and we can only theorize or abstract the real abstractions that effectively operate materially in the social world. But this is not an acceptation of relativism. Instead, is somehow the possibility of a scientific knowledge of social world. Exactly, I would say that, Diego. But you have then not as Harbajit said, like a problem of infinite regression of meta levels, but you have a different problem, which is circularity then. If the abstractions we use to cognize are the abstractions that are already embedded in the social world, how is that we have progress then? So we have like a conundrum here in the seminar, and this helps me basically assemble the problem space, which is basically that, like these two questions are great for that. On one side, you have like the problem of the independence of the scientific abstraction, which would makes it so that we have to think of levels and meta levels, and we have an infinite recursive problem, a problem of infinite regression, sorry. Or the second, which is, yeah, the abstractions, the scientific abstractions, they somehow is a very important set of problems here. I wrote 2 different papers that I can also add to the syllabus if there is interest. I'm not giving them as obligatory in any way, but anyway, I wrote 2 different papers that deal with that, which is the problem of transmission between real abstraction and scientific or thought abstraction. Like the one is the real abstraction and the given paper, and the other one just came out. It's a critique of Matin's concept. It has to do with art too, those who are interested in the art aspect here, and come from the art branch of the New Center. As you know, I'm part of both philosophy and art. And deals with Matin's concept of social dissonance in his artistic practice, but also as a kind of a practice that is wages on the production of a certain dissonance between individuals and their social role as productive of political practice too. So there's also a political element very important there. And he uses on Hattel. So in a certain sense, I have to. There is like a diagram there that suggests that the real abstraction is transmitted to thought abstraction in a very specific way, and in a very specific way, like there is functional bootstrapping. So we won't be able to really develop this here, but my idea is that the way out of, still undeveloped, but the way out of the conundrum between like infinite regression or independence, the independence of the cognizing mind and the social world, and and B, the circularity problem of the social abstractions being the scientific abstractions, and therefore progress is not possible, is the concept of functional bootstrapping. So functional bootstrapping is just the idea that you may have a set of elements, and this is for me comes, of course, the idea is not random, but comes from, for me, it comes from my reading of Between Saying and Doing, Robert Brandon's book. You have like a set of elements, and from these elements, depending on the way they are combined, you can get to, further results, and further results that are not close within the circle of the available real abstractions. Okay, so this would be kind of a way out, and I think we will gesture towards it towards the end of the seminar. Might the dialectic between the lived experience and the complex structures of the world be an analog to the more historical and hermeneutical concepts of Leibniz, and Erfahrung? These, my Heideggerian is kaput. So, yeah, I mean, maybe are these kind of, you said hermeneutical concepts, I'm taking maybe you're coming from the Heideggerian understanding of these concepts. I'm not super equipped to comment on that. Or is the dialectic here more spatial than the temporal historical character of Leibniz and Erfahrung? If you want, you can unmute yourself and explain to me the question, Arnaud.
Yes, JP, I was thinking of, I was like coming from a more Heideggerian, Gadamerinian definition of Leibniz and Erfahrung, and I was thinking if this was more like temporal or historical in relation to the subject and his conscious and the subject's consciousness, or in this case, in case of Jameson, it is more spatial.
Spatial,
like
yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think the Jameson's conception is ostensibly spatial, but also it has to be historical because it corresponds to also the way the space is reconfigured throughout history. Therefore, this is why we are talking about the stages of capitalist space.
Yes,
so
exactly.
Space itself, which is kind of space itself is changing and changing historically, and the different kind of structures that capital can come up with within its own historical unfolding beget this different spatial gradients of complexity between like domestic life, so to speak, and the social totality at whole. I think it's both it's temporal and spatial. Therefore, it's about like an unfolding of a different set of spaces that make it so that its experience and structure drift apart, and making it cognitive mapping a problem. Cognitive mapping would never appear as a problem if there wasn't that drift. So I think that would be like the wager here, the basic problem. Does that kind of answer you a little bit?
Yes, JP. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question. So at this point, I want to introduce another concept. This is Jameson, not me. That is basic to my argument, which I call the play of figuration. This is an essentially allegorical concept that supposes the obvious, namely, that these new and enormous global realities are inaccessible to any individual subject or consciousness, not even to Hegel, let alone Cecil Rhodes or Queen Victoria, which is to say that these fundamental realities are somehow ultimately unrepresentable, or to use the Althusserian phrase, are something like an absent cause. This is also in green and red because the absent cause will be chastised by Giannotti in his Contra Althusser. So we'll be talking about this, the absent cause or the metonymic cause structure. structure as a metonymic cause, sorry. To use the Althusserian phrase, we are something like an absent cause, are something like an absent cause, one that can never emerge into the presence of perception. So you don't have like so this is stronger, right, than what Jameson is talking about. But he's saying like there's at first this at the face of it, this enormous reality is unrepresentable. So you have this problem of the unrepresentable. In contemporary aesthetics, you can relate that to somebody like Lyotard and his wager on the concept of the sublime, exactly because contemporary art is kind of, in a certain sense, trying to represent the unrepresentable. So in Jameson, you have like a very materialist understanding of why that is. Like it's because of the historical unfolding of the different spaces of capital that makes it so that intimate individual life needs to address its structural determinations that are not at the same scale of itself. So therefore, the notion of an unrepresentable comes into play, in a certain sense. But actually, it couldn't be like simply unrepresentable if and to have cognitive mapping. Cognitive mapping is a certain way the devising of ways to figure that which resists figuration, which is not unrepresentable in a metaphysical sense, but which at least resists figuration due to its historical and spatial complexity. So cognitive map and the phenomenological cut or break, science or ideology. This is a very important question for us that will be addressed also within the seminar. Again, sorry about the typos. At this point, the phenomenological experience of the individual subject, traditionally the supreme raw materials of the work of art, becomes limited to a tiny corner of the social world, a fixed camera view of a certain section of London or the countryside or whatever, where the truth of that experience no longer coincides with the place in which it takes place. There comes into being then a situation in which we can say that if individual experience is authentic, then it cannot be true. That if a scientific or cognitive model of same content is true, then it escapes individual experience. But the truth of that experience no longer coincides with the place in which it takes place. Coming from the Althusserian point of view, as Jameson comes, it's interesting because here we have like a pure kind of definition of the place of science and not necessarily ideology in a certain sense, right? There's this epistemological break with a living subject that science introduces, and which is nicely expressed in this paradox. Again, as Jameson says, if individual experience is authentic, then it cannot be true. If a scientific model of the same content is true, then it escapes individual experience. Therefore, you have to have epistemological break to be able to describe that which individual experience cannot countenance. So this is science. This is not ideology. This is science here. It's really interesting. And the fact is that Jameson will pass through this concept of science, but at the same time, he wants it to have like an ideological practice that puts individual experience, that locates individual experience in this complexity of which science would have like the exclusivity to portray in a certain sense. So the truth of that limited daily experience of London lies rather in India or Jamaica or Hong Kong. It's bound up with the whole colonial system of the British Empire that determines the very quality of the individual's subjective life. Yet those structural coordinates are no longer accessible to the immediate lived experience, and are often not even conceptualizable for most people. So because of that, there are aesthetic strategies, like what he said, like play of figuration. There are aesthetic strategies to deal with that incompatibility. That's this incompatibility between lived experience and the scientific description of the structure. Everyone knows how, toward the end of the 19th century, a wide range of writers began to invent forms to express what I will call monadic relativism. in Gide and Conrad, in Fernando Pessoa, Pirandello, in Ford, and to a lesser extent in Henry James, even very obliquely in Proust, what we begin to see is the sense that each consciousness is a closed world, so that a representation of the social totality now must take the impossible form of a coexistence of those sealed subjective worlds and their peculiar interaction, which is in reality a passage of ships in the night, a centrifugal movement of lines and planes that can never intersect. The literary value that emerged from this new formal practice is called irony, and its philosophical ideology often takes the form of a vulgar appropriation of Einstein's theory of relativity. In this context, what I want to suggest is that these forms, whose content is generally that of privatized middle-class life, nonetheless stand as symptoms and distorted expressions of the penetration even of middle-class lived experience by the strange new global relativity of the colonial network. The one is then the figure, however, deformed and symbolically rewritten of the latter. I will take it that this figural process will remain central and in all later attempts to restructure the form of the work of art to accommodate content that must radically resist and escape artistic figuration. So, in a certain sense, the formal break and the formal relativity, the decentering of the point of view that one sees in modernism, not modernity, but aesthetic modernism, in a certain sense, is then a symptom and coping with this new reality, with this new thing that one can't possibly integrate to its own to one's own lived experience. Okay, this would be like the basic form. What do you mean by authentic in experience that is authentic? Yeah, that's he doesn't explain that. I'll take it like as this is a question from the chat. That's a good question. I have the same question. He doesn't explain that. I would say authentic as self-appropriated, like an authentic experience, the experience that is mine, that is authentically mine. I had authentically the experience means self-appropriated experience in a certain sense, not an alienated experience. I think authentic here is in a sense opposite to alienated experience. I'll say that, and therefore, if it's authentic, it cannot be true because actually the truth of contemporary experience is alienation. Is the very fact that the structural determinants of that experience are of a way different scale than the experience itself as authentic experience is able to countenance. Does that make sense? Upon the initial differentiations made in this session about the sign and the fact as main points of reference for both ideology and science and social outputs, is it possible for facts to operate within the ideological axis with the same properties relevance that signs have? Thinking about this mostly because of the main object of the seminar, Jameson's cognitive, along with his main epistemological approach as proposed by the author as didactic function. I mean, at the end of the day, every artistic effort is a fact, right? Yeah, but I'm not pitting sign against fact, right? I mean, I would say like representation is a fact too. Is a fact that figures another fact. So I wouldn't say there is an opposition between sign and fact, which seem to me like the crux of a question in a certain sense. And yes, is it possible for facts to operate within the ideological axis with the same potency or relevance signs have? I would say so, because of an arrangement of signs or a pre-comprehension of an ideological pre-comprehension of what we are doing is also a fact within the ideological world, so to speak. So I think so, yes. They will have the same potency, but the problem is like the scientific understanding of that ideological world is at odds with the immediate experience of that same world. So this is a problem that Jameson wants to treat. So I think the argument has a few stages. The first one, like science has to operate an epistemological break with the living experience. And as per this quote, just a second. It's certain that that is the case. Like science, economic science here describes the social totality without being integrated within lived experience. So there is like a dichotomy, a strong dichotomy there. In order to be science, you have to escape individual experience. But what Jameson wants, but then Althusser himself says like there are ideological practices too, not only scientific. So ideological practice is also crucial. We have to bear that in mind. Ideology it's not that ideology is bad. It's just that ideology is not science for Althusser. It's just that. And science, of course, is crucial. But ideology too is crucial for political work. For instance, you have to have a picture of your place in that world in order to be politically active. So it seems to me that Jameson is bringing politics to bear on the problem of the scientific break with the ideological that is motivated by the gradient of complexity between world and lived experience here. So I'll say like Jameson this is a very, very specific to Jameson, a very specific kind of operation, but it seems like he wants to bring to bear on a kind of a scientific problem of the description of the totality, the political action over this totality. So a bunch of problems comes from that. It's not for nothing that he offers the example of a film that is supposed to circulate the political experience of a specific collective within the US, which means this is not just a scientific description of the political experiment, but also a way to make it circulate, which means a way to cognitive map, also means not only here for Jameson, also means not only being able to adequately represent the object, but to represent the object with the degree of compression necessary for it to circulate within the social world and make it potent in an ideological sense too. This is why cognitive mapping as a task for art is crucial for politics for Jameson. This is how I understand why is it that for Jameson it is ideology that is making the cognitive mapping, because he wants it to be directly politically relevant, and to be directly politically relevant it has to circulate with a degree of compression and with and offering a certain self-understanding of the place of those subjects within the social totality. This was long, I'm sorry, but yeah, questions are really good. I really urge you to ask questions because it makes me really sharpen the ideas. Does that make it somehow clearer? I mean,
It does. I was
okay.
also, well, hello. Good morning to
Okay.
you all. Hope you're doing
Hello.
well. Do I sound okay?
Yeah,
Is it good?
perfect.
So yeah, it kind of does, I guess. Well, it was
Okay.
interesting, but it made me think at the same time upon whether there is this problem of the direction it takes. I think it also responds to the fact that Jameson conceives, and most of Jameson's work has this. It tends to be quite undetermined. It flirts with indeterminacy, and
Yeah.
that's why it becomes important to discuss ideology in a way. But I was also thinking upon this link you have made on the art practice and why is it important for cognitive mapping to develop within arts. At the end of the day, it's a political question, right? What does that say if we take into consideration, for example, Claire Roberts' definition of ideology has voluntary servitude? What is at stake with art there?
Yeah, I'll say what is at stake of to art in terms of
In terms of practice delineated, as Jameson says, has something which through ideology it can have a political effect.
Yeah, Yeah, but it's not any kind of ideology, right? Like you have
Yeah,
like
no, any.
yeah,
I don't care
yeah.
about any kind of particular
Yeah,
ideology.
the problem is like ideology is not for I wouldn't say like ideology is for Jameson just voluntary servitude. Like ideology, there's an ideological camp of forces, so to speak. So this is, I think we have to understand here in the seminar, like the ideology as a certain field of forces. As also there are scientific battles or scientific practices, but also ideological practices that kind of engage each other in an agonistic fashion, you know. And this is, I think, what Jameson is suggesting that art takes as a task. Of course, in the beginning, he says like he doesn't want art to be only that. He said like art will do many different stuff, and this is normal. This is okay. This is all well and good. But he suggests it also takes up the task of cognitive mapping to engage in ideological battle, because it's not ideology is not one thing like voluntary servitude or anything like that, even though ideology has been portrayed as that many times in history in different guises. We'll talk about this with William Clare Roberts' essay. It's really great in that respect. You have like the purely negative concept of ideology too, so it's also a very equivocal concept. But here we are not necessarily dealing with as I said before, it's not that ideology is bad per se. Ideology is, for the Althusserian point of view, which is also Jameson's here, is unextricable from social life. You have to have ideology, not because you have to have as an imperative, but because being in the socius is living within ideology. So it's part of. This is why I think Sellars, and this is also part of the project of bridging like Marx and Pittsburgh School, because this is why I think Sellars is useful also, because Sellars shows that we live in world pictures that are composed by the inferential links within the language, within the very language we use. So in a certain sense, like the Sellarian picture makes it so to show that how is it that ideology is inextricable from social life. And so in a sense, but a second element is that ideology is not unitary. It's not one ideology. It's not the ideology. It's like ideology has like a also a multiplicity, an ideological multiplicity within this ideological field. So we need to engage in ideological battle. I would say this is kind of the political crux of this paper. But then there's also a problem. You said like in your question that artists must engage in that. Yes, I think Jameson is saying that, but he's saying not only that, he's saying that art is already a product of that also. So there's an ambiguity there. As a kind of prescriptive paper, his cognitive mapping paper, he said like, yeah, I want that to have like a function in the construction of a socialist alternative and things like that. So there's a prescriptive element, but there is also a descriptive element, and the description is exactly that. How is it that we can understand the procedures of modernism as a way to cope with already the problem of cognitive mapping in a certain sense? So there is an ambiguity whether like cognitive mapping is just a descriptive thing or a prescriptive thing. As a prescriptive thing, I would say it is an element of an ideological battle to be engaged in by art. But as a descriptive thing, it's also that which explains certain plays of figuration that he's trying to explain that comes about in modernism and postmodern forms of art making. So how to parse these two elements, the descriptive and prescriptive? I'd say there's a difference between having it as a symptom of one's work of art and having it as an ostensibly and overtly assumed objective. So in a certain sense, the prescriptive is just to basically assume and ostensibly engage in what was always already, but in a confused form and implicit form, part of what art was doing for Jameson, it seems to me. At least that would be my answer. Is that helpful?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. So yeah, just half an hour. I think at least we'll get to the end of the slides. That will be great. So aesthetic strategies are just read the third stage. Sorry, I can't read this. Where? No, just a second. Late capitalism and postmodernist space. So if this is so for the age of imperialism, how much more must it hold for our own moment, the moment of the multinational network, or what Mandel calls late capitalism, a moment in which, and this is old, huh? we could say like we could even talk about the fourth, fifth stage. Anyway, but he stops at this third stage. The moment of the multinational network, what Mandel calls late capitalism, a moment in which not merely the older city, but even the nation state itself had ceased to play a central, functional, and formal role in the process that has, in a new quantum leap of capital, prodigiously expanded beyond them, leaving them behind as ruined and archaic remains of earlier stages in the development of this mode of production. Briefly, I want to suggest that the new space involves the suppression of distance, in the sense of Benjamin's aura, like critical distance between art object and consumer, right? And the relentless saturation of any remaining voids and empty places to the point where the postmodern body, whether wandering through a postmodern hotel, locked into rock sound by means of headphones, or undergoing the multiple shocks and bombardments of the Vietnam War, as Michael Herr conveys it, to us is now exposed to a perceptual barrage of immediacy from which all sheltering layers or intervening mediations have been removed. There are, of course, many other features of this space one would ideally want to comment on, most notably Lefebvre's concept of abstract space, as what is simultaneously homogeneous and fragmented. But I think that the peculiar disorientation of the saturated space I have just mentioned will be the most useful guiding thread. So, like his critique of postmodernism, in the sense of embodying a certain logic of this third stage of capitalist space, right? And that in a certain sense it is embodied in that kind of representation, that the very critical distance required to make the cognitive mapping is kind of distorted or erased. At the same time, this erasure itself is an expression of the experience of this postmodernist stage of capital space, so to speak, which is, it has like a double function here, which is kind of interesting also. Just to go ahead a little bit, you should understand that I take such spatial peculiarities of postmodernism as symptoms and expressions of a new historical original dilemma, one that involves our insertion. Here it comes. Our insertion as individual subjects into a multidimensional set of radical discontinuous realities. So here, like our insertion as individual into this structure, which is the function of ideology, in our Althusserian sense, whose frames range from the still surviving spaces of bourgeois private life all the way to the unimaginable decentering of global capital itself. Not even Einsteinian relativity or the multiple subjective worlds of older modernists is capable of giving any kind of adequate figuration to this process. So that kind of modernist irony, it's over. We can't figure it with modernist irony, right? Which in lived experience makes itself felt by the so-called death of the subject, or more exactly, the fragmented and schizophrenic decentering and dispersion of this last, which can no longer even serve the function of the Jamesian reverberator or point of view. Although you may not have realized it, I'm talking about practical, here's the point, the last point, the point of the last question also. I'm talking about practical politics here. Since the crisis of socialist internationalism and the enormous strategic and tactical difficulties of coordinating local and grassroots or neighborhood political actions with national or international ones, such urgent political dilemmas are all immediately functions of the enormously complex new international space I have in mind. So there's a political task, and the political task is related to cognitive mapping, but then cognitive mapping could be understood as in the Marxian sense or Althusserian sense as the purview of science, or in the Jamesonian sense as the purview of ideology. in the Jamesonian sense, it was always already part of the artistic practice, but at the same time, it becomes an overt task to engage in it, because what counts for him is an ideological battle, which is where the political is played out, is directly played out. Like the scientific, in a certain sense, can and will, of course, inform the ideological, right? But if you believe, if Althusser is to be believed, there is a break with lived experience that makes it so that it's there's a problem in locating the subject itself within the space described by science, or by materialist science, Marxist science. Okay. So here he like finally comes to the definition of cognitive mapping. He uses this sociologist, urbanist Kevin Lynch. I'm tempted to describe the way I understand this concept as something of a synthesis between Althusser and Kevin Lynch. A formulation that, to be sure, does not tell you much unless you know that Lynch is the author of a classic work, The Image of the City, which in its turn spawned a whole low-level subdiscipline that today takes the phrase cognitive mapping as its own designation. My use of the book will be emblematic, since the mental map of the city space explored by Lynch can be extrapolated to the mental map of the social and global totality we all carry around in our heads in variously garbled forms. So he mentions that Kevin Lynch's book, Lynch has carried out interviews with inhabitants of Boston, Jersey City, Los Angeles, and in order to understand how the city is figured within these inhabitants' minds. And sometimes you can get to very different maps, but maps that are also relative to their usefulness, specific usefulness, and to their specific, the specific neighborhoods or the specific uses those people make of their city. And so in the sense that cognitive mapping is here this process of figuring a city from the point of view of those using it. So this is why, he say like it will be cognitive mapping for him, it will be an extrapolated form of that, which is a mental map made by a user of that which is that space where is in, right? Extrapolated to the social and global totality, right? Drawing on the downtowns of Boston, Jersey City, and Los Angeles, and by means of interviews and questionnaires in which subject we asked to draw their city context from memory, Lynch suggests that urban alienation is directly proportional to the mental unmappability of local cityscapes. So not knowing one's way around, like it's directly proportional to alienation. And again, like with Althusser, I have always been struck by the way in which Lynch's conception of city experience, the dialectic between the here and now of immediate perception and the imaginative or imaginary sense of the city as an absence totality, presents something like a spatial analog of Althusser's great formulation of ideology itself, as the imaginary representation of the subject's relationship to his or her real conditions of existence. We'll be developing that at length in the third section, not today, but at least we have like already, I feel, assembled the problem space and have an intuitive grasp of this thing. Whatever its defects and problems, this positive conception of ideology as a necessary function in any form of social life has the great merit of stressing the gap between the local positioning of the individual subject and the totality of class structures in which he or she is situated, a gap between phenomenological perception and the reality that transcends all individual thinking or experience. But this ideology as such attempts to span or coordinate, to map by means of conscious and unconscious representations. So here, like finally the full-fledged program, like expressed in Althusserian terms. I'm getting to the end of my slides. So we have still 20 minutes. Maybe you have time for introductions by the students by the end, which was like Gabriel was suggesting me to do it in the end of the sessions, because this session probably will go to YouTube. So instead of having like in the beginning, have it at the end. So maybe you'll have time for that today, which will be nice. Then I'll just get to the end here. Here I'm drawing, making it, I'm using this paper that I will add to the syllabus. I will add a couple of papers still to the syllabus. One of them is like this great paper suggested by Fernando Zalamea to the Glassbead Journal under the name Cosmo Capras. I think it's his pseudonym, which is called Wittgenstein Sheaves. And like, what is this? Is it gives us like a great example of cognitive mapping, so to speak, like the way a certain thing appears as certain other thing through the workings of concept-mediated language. So this is just, I want to leave it there for the reflection, and I will include this text to the next session also. So here's his text. There is a narrow corridor at Penn Station linking the subway with the NJ transit platforms. The walls of this narrow corridor were always lined with vagrants and bums, wrapped in trash bags, sleeping on cartons, hugging their few belongings crammed into little trolleys, most of them soaked in their own urine, all of them half crazy, mumbling to themselves, delirious. The great American workforce, flowing in from New Jersey every morning, would have to squeeze through this small tributary, this corridor of urine and bums. The sight hardly slowed anyone down. They passed by it, unflustered, like a river passes over the pebbles on its bed. I had to pass through it too, going upstream into New Jersey. Every day I had to go through this corridor of urine to end up in the ivory tower room at Princeton to engage in a calligraphy of argument maps, a feast of cream cheese bagels and grapes. All the while, a million people pass through the urine-soaked bums of Penn Station, me included, without ever being struck. Of course, they understand. Like, there is a difference. There is a subtle difference right there, right? Like being struck and understanding, like that in a sense may or may not map onto the difference between science and ideology. Like ideology is about being struck by something, perhaps, while understanding theoretically is the purview of science. And I too would pass them by as I got urinated out into New York in the evening. But now I must pass them as one passes kidney stones. These vagrants are the kidney stones that no system of ideas has managed to pass. And just as microscopic kidney stones are capable of incapacitating an entire organism, so these vagrants are capable of shutting down the kidney function of the whole of humanity. To see these pebbles as kidney stones, to be struck by a new aspect. This paper is one of my favorite papers, like short papers I ever read. Like I'll send that to you and put it in the syllabus. It's not, it doesn't deal with Marxism or Marxist science in any way, but it deals with the changing aspect. And the idea is like he's dealing with like Wittgenstein's later kind of method of gluing different language games as like, and the way they constitute sheaves, like sheaves like topological spaces that are glued onto each other, right? So through the examples, through the individual examples, and drawing comparisons between the examples, you create these sheaves, you create these topological areas where they are, in a certain sense, connected through their resemblance or through the way one makes another like struck, like an aspect appears through the juxtaposition of these different uses. This is a great paper, really, and I was always struck again by the fact that this paper, in a certain sense, is very useful in understanding cognitive mapping. It's very useful in understanding the fact that we have like a language-laden reality, conceptual-laden reality, because we are language users. But at the same time, there is a certain immediacy to that language use, but a certain mediation that it makes, that appears when we are able to see something through an aspect that was not available before, right? Seeing something to be struck by a new aspect. So in language, you have this way of, making comparisons that make certain aspects manifest themselves. So this is a great example in the Zalamea paper of that process, which is for me like a passage between a certain kind of immediate sensibility to a kind of an intelligible element, but an intelligible element that is also not only the result of an understanding, of a theoretical understanding, but a certain kind of aspect that appears within the experience itself. So we have like this mediation between that which is capable of producing science with that which is the ideological result of that abstraction as applied to our everyday like dealings, linguistic dealings. So as the object leaves the sensible scale, it needs to be recovered by a mapping process that exists through the concept. You do not see that X is X, you see X as a result of the effort of mapping. Or not the effort of mapping, you are struck by a new aspect because a new comparison appears. So you compare those vagrants as to kidney stones. So a certain image of the totality or a localized totality at least appears, makes itself manifest through being struck by this kind of aesthetic comparison between things, right? So this is I think a great way, a great example, a great way to understand cognitive mapping in that aesthetic sense. But it's also fundamentally different from the cognitive mapping that Marx is putting forward here through theoretical scientific abstractions, right? And through this concentration, to this synthesis of abstractions to form concrete objects. So to deal with this problem and these differences is kind of also the purview of this seminar. And this gives us a set of problems, as I was already announcing. Like today we talked a little bit about figuration between art and science. Why is it that art is important for Jameson? And second session, we'll talk about the figuration between experience and concept. So we have to rehearse the critique of the given and how concepts shape experience too. It's not like a rigid dichotomy. It has to do with the fact that experience is concept laden also. And figuration between science and ideology in the third session, where we finally really get to the flesh of the Althusserian picture. And finally, figuration between cognizing and constraining, which is the fact that these cognizing elements are given through the social life, according to the Giannotti picture, and to basically Zonhato, the thinkers of real abstraction, would agree with Giannotti in that sense, and would be critical of the Althusserian kind of divide between science and ideology in that sense. And of course, one would understand why is it that this constraining elements to cognition is kind of crucial both to the affiguration of the whole, because it places the cognizing subject within the historical unfolding of this totality being represented, right? And also, of course, to the ideological, not only the scientific, but the ideological battles one must engage with, in the sense that the figures of comparison are there, circulating in the social world as we speak. Okay, I think that would be it for today. We can have a couple more questions, or maybe you have the introductions of student introductions in the last like 12 minutes that we have. There's one question. If I could elaborate on functional bootstrapping, yeah? Could you elaborate on that, what you call functional bootstrapping? Specifically, how do you deal with reference in the case of exiting the problem of the drift of experience and structure complexity and schizophrenia of circularity due to the problem of independence of scientific abstraction? Yeah, the thing is, this is really a huge question. Maybe we should even leave it for later, because I will send those texts, and there are two texts that I deal with it, in which I deal with it, like the real abstraction and the given, and the convex portrait in the self mirror. which is like John Ashbery scrambled. um, um, this is a huge question, like, because it's basically a whole theoretical task there. But in a nutshell, the problem I can state the problems it tries to address. One of the problems is like, if we have a problem, from where does scientific abstractions come from? We have a problem with that. Like, if you don't want to say that this is a natural given of the human mind beyond any kind of historical process, you have to say that it comes from the social world or the historical process in a certain sense. But if you say that, you get to the circularity problem, one. And second, if it's not a circularity problem, there's still, if you don't get to the circularity problem, you still have the problem of the transmission between real abstraction and thought abstractions. So in a nutshell, a real abstraction, as Zonhatl defines it, is, for instance, the fact that there is an abstraction that is not of thinking, that is real out there. This abstraction is value. Why is it? Where does it come about? For Zonhatl, it comes about when we equate two different, empirically different objects. We equate them. We treat them as equivalent. So money form is the posited being of this equivalence. For Zonhatl, the fact that you have like equivalence between different objects is what enables Greek philosophy to assert things like everything is water, or everything is fire, or everything is the indeterminate, apeiron, whatever. So you have like the beginning of philosophy once you have like real abstraction of that. And this abstraction is real in what sense? In the sense that nobody is really thinking the money form. The money form comes about as the solving of a practical problem, which is the equivalence that emerges through the sheer act of trading, of exchanging goods. And the equivalence then is the product of the exchange, not the product of the thinking of the exchange. So why is it that okay? Why that is the case is because like the exchangers are not thinking of equivalence; they are thinking of difference. I'm exchanging something with you because I want a different thing. I want the use value that is embedded in your product, and you want the use value that is my product. And because we are focused on difference, that the equivalence emerges, and the equivalence emerges as a real abstraction because it's not inside anyone's head. And once it autonomizes, you have like a pattern of behavior. We are constrained by this abstraction that is not in anybody else's head. This is really powerful, I think, description. So functional bootstrapping, for instance, in the Zonhattelian sense, like I think I'm, if I'm not mistaken, I'm the only one that thinks that Zonhatl is a thinker of functional abstraction, functional bootstrapping, because Zonhatl thinks that Greek philosophy, Galilean science, comes because of these kind of exchange abstractions. So the scientific abstraction comes about in social life first through exchange abstraction. But there's a problem of transmission. And my paper deals with the problem of transmission. How is it that through sheer exchanging, that is not in anyone's head, you get from that to scientific representations? It's completely unclear, right? Completely unclear. And Zonhatl does not give us that. Zonhatl just states, yeah, things get transmitted or somehow. So the problem of transmission between those is what's interesting to me. And I think in that paper, for instance, the example I give is the fact that this is already happened. You have a pattern, then you have the solution, a practical solution to a practical pattern, which is coinage. So you have a coin, and because you have coinage, it starts making sense, the idea of having a representative of something else that is empirically different, yet establishes an equivalence between many things. So a new form of thought is born out of the sheer arrangement of an already existing practice. So the practice exists of exchanging goods. Then coinage comes as a solution to a practical problem. Then coinage becomes a suggestion of a new theoretical tool, the theoretical tool of representation that is akin to linguistic representation, but it's a real thing in a certain sense. So, in a sense, this is what functional bootstrapping means. Functional bootstrapping in the Brandonian sense means like you have a certain set of discursive practice, and by engaging, by assembling them with a certain specific circuit, you gain degrees of expressibility. So you don't need to add something from without, you just need to rearrange them to have a new kind of expressibility. So this is analogous. The idea is that if you have like a certain social practice where you have exchange abstraction and you have coinage makes it so that a new kind of doxastic a new kind of doxastic element, doxastic meaning, a new kind of thought abstraction emerges out of the observation of the abstractions that get generated in the social world. So there's functional abstraction because this new functional bootstrapping, because this new form of thought is also something that will come and circulate within the social world itself. Therefore, you have a bigger set of forms of thought than before through the functional bootstrapping. That is like the blind process of social functioning, through the blind process of social functioning and its interrelation with thinking subjects. So I'm sorry this was not clear, but this is it's because it's a huge question. I mean, at least is it kind of
Yes,
intuitive?
yes.
Yeah.
I then arrive at the question, which I'm assuming we can leave for the next seminars, of compression.
Oh, yeah.
I immediately think of compression, but maybe we can leave the conversation for the
Yeah,
next.
compression is a great question, and it already came in today because of the function that Jameson wants R to have in a certain sense. It's not just science. Of course, there's compression in scientific description too, but there's a specific type of compression that seems to be important in art to make it so that it makes circulate a certain form of mapping of the social whole. That's a fantastic question. Thank you so much. Too. Could you tell us a little more about G2, Generality 2? Yeah, you should ask that. I'll just say that because it doesn't say much. But anyway, yeah, it's just the fact there is a Generality 2 is like a current. It's just a current kind of piece of scientific or ideological practice that is brought to bear in Generality to Generality 1 in order to produce a certain different form of generality. It's just a really formal, only strictly formal kind of description of what's going on in the example that Althusser gives. Like Hegel is like generality too, like what's the current kind of the current the more advanced current ideological or scientific a scientific candidate of a theoretical practice. It was Hegelianism, you see. So in Althusser, an example like it's Hegelianism that is brought to bear to classical political economy that makes it so that value form is generated as a scientific object in a way that it wasn't available to the classical economists. So it's the dynamics of value form as depicted in the chapter 1 of Capital in a certain sense could be portrayed as the application of Generality 2, which is Hegelianism, or the forms of Hegelian science of logic, especially the category of the Gesetzsein, posited being, as it appears in the Logic of Essence, to political economy. And we'll be talking extensively about it because it's also Giannotti's interpretation of chapter 1. It's Gesetzsein, posited being, like a Hegelian category, like you have like the real existence of that Hegelian category in the constitution of value in the Marxian sense. But it's also like for Althusser, though, it's like the application of a state-of-the-art kind of form of thinking, which is Hegelianism, to classical political economics that yields what would be like the specific form of Marxian value. But I don't, that's an example. So I think G2 is basically one state-of-the-art, so to speak, form of ideological or scientific practice that is brought to bear in G1 to G1 in order to have G3. I think there are all there is to it, basically. I don't remember Althusser saying that much about G2. G2 corresponds to the materials, to the technology in the productive process in a certain sense. So of course G2 is also could be also G1. If you read Marxism as operating on Hegelianism, you could invert that, right? You could see it. You could consider Hegel like G1, and G2 is political economy. And if G2 is applied to G1 in that sense, it makes Hegelianism material because the forms of Hegelianism are actually present in material practice and not in the unfolding of spirit itself. So you could actually kind of mess around a little bit with the terms, and you get like slightly different results. It's just like a formal category. It's just the category of that which you use to read off something that is in G1. Does that help? I'll just say does not talk a great deal about that. So, I have Niam and Arnab. Niam?
Hi, yeah. Thanks, Neve. So I'm just wondering, what do you think about the work that the logic of compossibility does for Jameson in his theory of the kind of totality that art can have access to ideology, whereas science can't, because science is more based on a mereological, part whole sort of relation, idea of theory of totality, at its worst, a kind of scientific reductionism is, already positing a kind of an idealism of the things in themselves, let's say, for scientific realism. But it just seems to me that there's he's critical of, like, the fragmented subject in postmodernism, but it's doing a lot of work for him, because he talks about this transposition from the autonomy to in high modernity to post-modernity fragmentation, and kind of from depth to surface, and this idea of the abstract surface completely separated, and then it's the fragmented subject then that art is kind of working with, and that the sort of possible relations, relationality or dynamic of relationality, and its kind of compossibility that somehow can be about that mediated space that from the kind of ground up can shift, or is in some ways rearrange the kind of material relations through which a kind of an ideology understood in the protagonist sense, from William Clare Roberts, where it's not about the ideal to which the ruling class legitimizes its domination, but it is about those material sort of forces, like you're saying, in the kind of the field. So I'm just wondering, I mean, what I'm really trying to say is the logic of compossibility that seems to, and the connection with the fragmented subject, those seem to be kind of important. That's a kind of an ontology almost, like,
Yeah, I'll have to think about it, because I wasn't thinking about this before. Yeah, it seems like a fruitful way to look into it. I haven't really thought about this logic of compossibility yet, but with regards to science, the science ideology kind of shift, it seems to me that the way this gap is mobilized by Jameson is interesting, because it's also ambiguous, right? Like, it's maybe this, what you call this ontological space, is the space where there's this ambiguity between science and ideology is played out in a certain sense. Because you have, like, for instance, scientific notions, right? Like, he wants really to have like a kind of a truthful purview to the relationship between this subject and this incompossible space of determination. So this seems to be like a scientific thing, but at the same time, this scientific thing is translated to experience through certain forms of coping, or certain forms of experience that are refracted experience, diffracted, alienated experiences that are translated through art, like with certain forms of formal protocols that have to be devised to translate these kinds of experience. So in a certain sense, like there is like this passage from a scientific kind of description. If you have to use like the pair, I'm not necessarily convinced that the pair behaves as Althusser wants it to, but anyway, if you want to, it is the pair that Jameson also uses. So in a certain sense, science is diffracted through science is diffracted to the scientific notions, the scientific description is diffracted to the lived experience through the ideological space that can be either the forms of the sheer forms of coping that the individual has with this kind of logic, and also the artistic expressions of this refracted kind of experience that the individual must have. So in the sense that this composes an ontology, it's kind of interesting because in a certain sense, this ontology would be like the neutral space within that composes, that is the composition of this refracted scientific totality through the ideological lenses of everyday life in a certain sense. Does that make sense, what you're saying in a certain sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I have to think more of this question. You can, I'll look into
Yeah, I mean,
it.
he just mentions Leibniz a lot, which is really interesting, and that's the logic of compossible worlds, sense making and world is kind of
Yeah, but the compossible world is the concept. I mean, my question to that would be like, is the compossible world within the space of lived experience or within the scientific description of capital? Or is there no scientific description of capital that is possible outside of the sheer cognitive mapping that has to go through lived experience to get to accede to it, to access it? It seems to me like that the Leibnizian image pertains to lived experiences and their diffracted space, their decentered space, more than actual capital structures, which should be neutral regarding like the proper world mereology there. Like it's one world, like it's just one very complex one, but it's one world in the scientific image. In the scientific image, one world, right? In the phenomenological image is like a
multiverse
space of compossibility between worlds. It seems to me.
Yeah.
Something like that. So it's a problem of translation and as a compression too. It's a problem like the compression between one and the other.
But he also talks about he's interested in that shift between media as well.
Yeah.
And he's interested also in the kind of differences between, not inscriptions, I mean, he's not using that word, but that kind of the externalization of the fragmented subject, and the lived experience through different media in art. Yeah.
Okay, many thanks for the question. I'll get back to it. It's a very, it holds water. I have to think about it.
Okay, thank you.
I don't remember who was it. Arnab, I think, first.
JP, I was thinking of our present datafication of the world, of everything that is out there, the subject and the world, and how this datafication is now being monetized in a variety of ways, to the extent that data itself might count as a kind of like currency, that the exchange of data, if we consider data as the raw materials of like of G1, not G1, but rather how these raw materials of the real world and the subject, how they are worked upon by G2, then.
But then I'm not sure. Like you have like a very specific example in mind, right? Like
yes.
Like data in the sense of that which is kind of monetized in personal experience, like in social networks, this kind of thing.
Exactly, because the specific example I was talking about is like data being injected with value and
Yeah, of course.
and serving as a sort of uh, standard of exchange,
Mhm.
like between companies and or individuals and companies or between individuals. So if it comes
In a
to
different
this,
sense, right? In a slightly different sense between individuals and individuals and companies.
exactly. So,
There's an
so I was
overlap.
thinking,
Yeah.
yes. So I was thinking if this becomes a sort of uh, if this at one time like in the near future becomes a sort of standard, it replaces the money economy uh, by uh, by this kind of injection of value and the standardization of data as currency, then isn't this
Well, but Arnab, there's a leap there. Like how is it like that? You know, the data will be a standard, because to be a standard you have to have like a self identity in a certain sense. And I think data can be a standard, but then you have to have like a measure, like a specific measure of
yes
data to be the standard of data, and that would be like the mediation between different kinds of data, you know. But then you have to
yes
establish a
exactly
measure. For instance, this Giannotti talks about it in value form in Marx, but also in Wittgenstein when he talks about the Parisian meter. Like 1 meter was like a piece of aluminum, a specific piece of aluminum. So like you have like this, you have this category which is extension, but extension itself cannot be the criterion. You have to have like a standard within extension to be the criterion of extension itself. But the standard has to be a piece of the category. You know, the standard has to be homogeneous to the category. Of course, in the empirical world, we are talking about measures and extensions. But in value is not the criterion is only immanent to value itself, but that doesn't mean that the criterion can be anything. You have to determine a certain amount of data to be the criterion of data itself, if data will be the currency in a certain sense. It seems to me like it's a bit circular, though. When you say like data will be the currency, it seems to me that could be could be the standard, as gold was the standard of value or something like that. But then you
yes
have to measure the data that it values the standard of value, which means you have to have value to measure the value. I mean, you understand what I'm saying?
circularity, yes, it's a
Yeah, there's
circularity.
circularity. So I'm not sure
Yes.
how that would work, and how does that portrays into the how that weaves into the question of generalities. I have to think of that, because generalities in a certain theory of the generalities is the theory of the constitution of new science. So I'm not sure that the acquiring of a new standard for value is basically is a new kind of science. I mean, a new kind of science would be the science that is able to describe a science that is able to describe data as value, for instance. Maybe that would be what you are getting at. What is the science that would describe data as value? In a certain sense, we are in the process of getting to that, because since data is value now, nobody knows, but we could get to the point that we have like a whole new economy where like data is value. I mean, part of it is already, finance is that up to a point. So yeah, there are attempts already. Like, yeah, maybe I could connect your question to finance. Basically, what are the G2s that are applied to the data of finance? Because in finance, data has value in the sense of expectations and information. Information has value. You have information of a certain sector, of course, you will wage differently in the market. So it's very, very, very sensitive to expectation. Therefore, information is a currency. So what is G2? What is G2 that makes G1? G1, which is the functioning of the financial market, readable as a G3, as a new form of science of economics that is an unstable form of economics. I don't know. There maybe I'm ignorant about it, but I think at least I would express your problem like that. You have like something, some kind of different element that is being measured as value, and this element is sensitive to intentionality. As in your example, it was like personal identity in the social networks, but it could be any kind of piece of information that is available
Yes,
to a
yes.
vast network, as in finance, you see. And then you have to have like an economic science of finance that is not, an economic science of modes of production only, but also an economic science that is sensible to tracing the movements of the valorization of expectations that comes about within this mobilization of data within this milieu. I'm not sure. I'm improvising here because it's a very complex question. How
Thank
am
you,
I
JP.
doing? Is that bad? Is completely off the mark?
No, JP, that helped. That helped.
Okay.
Uh,
We will
Thank
talk
you so
about
much.
that then more. It's interesting. Thank you.
Sure, JP. Sure, JP. Thank you.
Raviv, finally.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm doing well. Good to see
Okay.
everyone. I guess maybe because we're at the end of the session, I don't want to keep everyone. I'll save some of this for maybe another time. But I've been recently trying to track down this correspondence between Adorno and Benjamin that is referenced in Adorno's Introduction to Dialectics, where they have a disagreement about Benjamin's reading of a poem of Baudelaire, where he's talking, but kind of similarly about like rag pickers in Paris, these sort of like vagrant sort of homelessness kind of characters, and how he's using them to illustrate different aspects of like capital in general. Adorno has a huge problem with this, but and maybe I could get into it another time, but it just kind of reminded me of this moment where you were talking about the representability of totality in the analysis of capital and stuff like that. And, if, like you mentioned earlier, we're to say knowledge is not an empirical description of something, but the ability to assign something to a logical space of reasons coherently. What can you say about like whether or not you could admit these massive abstractions as part of like a causal chain adequately, or if that's something that you're not really able to do, or I don't know.
Yeah, that's good. Like I feel you're asking like what degree of reality can we assign to the abstractions used to, for instance, describe the capitalist mode of production. What degree of reality in the sense of a causal chain? You're saying, are you pitting causal chain with against the justificatory chain? That's the kind of presupposition here.
Oh, I think I meant
like for instance in
I think I was
in Sellarianism we would say something like this.
Yeah.
Like an element in the causal chain does not by itself justify. It can be described. You can see like I can drop my cell phone and because of gravity, whatever, it falls down. You can describe, but you cannot justify just through sheer causality. This is because you can justify why is it that the cell phone drops, but the cell phone dropping does not have normative power. It's just a sheer happening. So this is the specific, division of labor between the normative and the causal in the Sellarian picture. And this is also why is it that just seeing something is not sufficient, or sheer contact with an experience is not sufficient for knowledge. Knowledge you have to kind of justify, because in order for something to be knowledge, and this is very, I think, intuitive, actually. What I'm saying, it's not intuitive, but but it can become intuitive if you think of knowledge as being able to connect some information to another, and then it becomes knowledge. So just contact with an experience, you're not able to do that. If you have contact with an experience and then you are able to connect that experience inferentially with other experience, then you have knowledge, which means also you can parse that also further as being able to talk more about that which was experienced. And talking more about what is experience means connecting that piece of experience to another piece of experience. So this is very, it ends up in a good circularity, where it becomes like very intuitive to think of knowledge as actually a certain degree of connectivity between pieces of experience, not just the experience. You can have like a sensation of blue without, and of course there is a way, a façon de parler, a way to speak where you say like, I know blue. No, you just had an impression of blue. You know blue because you learned what blue is before. So there is this problem that is very, very kind of complicated, but next session will be like that. It's a good segue to next session, this question. And I take it what you're asking is, what degree of existence can we assign things like class, value, and things like that, given that these are fashioned within the normative space of science making, while at the same time, we are thinking that these are explainers of reality. If these are explainers of reality, do they exist without the theory, or they exist just within the theory, which would be maybe the result of the Althusserian picture, which is a problem, the problem of the reference of these terms. Well, Sellars has an answer to that. Like if you have, of course, these are always fashioned within the space of reasons, because these are linguistic mental ideas. This is linguistic objects like value form. Value form is a linguistic thing. It's a linguistic object. Class is a linguistic object that we use to trace things out there. So what is the relationship between these linguistic objects and the abstractions that they are purported to represent within the social whole? For Sellars, Sellars tries to carve a middle ground between these kind of linguistic collective pragmatism and scientific realism by saying if it makes you predict something, you have good reason to think that these abstractions are out there. I mean, the counterparts of these abstractions, which are linguistic objects, of course, literally, but the counterparts of them are out there. This is why there is a scientific realist. So if we when you replace volume theory of gas with a molecular theory of gases, and you're able to predict better the behavior of gases in a chamber with a molecular theory, you have good reason to think that molecules are there. And this seems like trivial, but this is a huge debate in the philosophy of science between instrumentalism and realism. So an instrumentalist would say like, yeah, I'm not seeing molecules, I'm just postulating molecules, and molecules help me explain what's happening. You could extrapolate that to science, Marxist science, and say, no, there's no such thing as class. Class is an explainer that within the theory help us make predictions. Sellars would not say that, would say like class is a thing. Class is a thing to the extent that we are able to predict with class. And we are able to predict with class and value and labor and all of that, which means there are real counterparts of the word designs we use to refer to these things. There are real counterparts out there. We are actually tracing something out there with these real counterparts. And it's like a middle ground between, let us say, for the speculative realists amongst us, between correlationism and, realism that Sellars is carving. And I think it's interestingly applicable to Marxist science. I mean, at least in my view. I think we're up. Like, yeah, there's a raised hand by Gabriel already. So
yeah, I'm afraid we are out of time, but and we already some students manifested in the chat saying that they had to go for today. So we might use the beginning of the next session to the introductions. But it was great. It was wonderful.
Thank you. Had a good time. Thank you all for coming. I think that's it. See you next
Yeah.
time. See you next week.
Thank you, JP. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.